Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We'll begin with Story 1. The Year Without a Summer Life in a Frozen 1816. In the spring of 1815, Mount Tambora erupted on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. It was one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history. But what does a volcano halfway around the globe have to do with the gray-skied gloom that settled over Europe and North America the following year? This is a story about the long shadow of ash and what happened when summer never truly came. You wake to the smell of damp straw. It's June, but the frost on the thatch roof says otherwise. Your breath coils visibly in the air of your modest cottage on the edge of Lake Geneva. In the distance, your goats stir uncomfortably, hungry and underfed. The garden that should have been full of shoots and promise lies barren. This isn't just a late frost. It's the beginning of a year without a summer. Weather that would not leave. The cold came slowly, but it stayed with persistence. In New England, snow fell in June. In England, the skies remained overcast for weeks at a time. And in Switzerland, where our story begins, daily life became a quiet test of patience. Peasants watched their barley blacken in the fields. There was a faint sulfuric taste in well water. The rain, when it came, was heavy and unrelenting. Modern climatologists understand this now. Sulfur dioxide from the Tambora eruption had entered the stratosphere, creating a reflective haze that cooled the planet by as much as 3 degrees Celsius. But back then, people had no names for such things. They only had suspicion. The sun was pale and weak. Some said it was punishment, others an omen. In this place and time, superstition filled the gaps where science did not yet reach. Daily life in a gray summer. For families in rural Europe, survival had always been precarious. But 1816 pushed those limits further. Bread became thinner. Porridge became the staple. In Switzerland, reports show that the average family cut caloric intake in half by midsummer. Meals consisted of whatever could be salvaged: nettles, boiled roots, sometimes the remnants of spoiled stores. Those with livestock fared marginally better. Goats provided milk, though even their output dwindled. The cows, when they could not be fed, were sold, slaughtered, or simply died. The rich retreated to their estates, burning coal and wine casks to stay warm. But for most, there was no firewood to spare. A Swiss farmer's diary from June 1816 notes, "My wife knits by the window because there is no oil for the lamp. We eat twice a day now. I sold my best boots for flour." There was no time for rebellion nor energy for protest. Only routine: chop, boil, wait. Byron's villa in the Gothic summer. Ironically, it was in this same damp summer that Lord Byron hosted a group of friends at the Villa Diodati near Lake Geneva. Among them were Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Godwin, soon to be Mary Shelley, and Dr. John Polidori. With nowhere to go and only cold mist around them, they entertained each other with ghost stories. It was here, in the suffocating gloom of the year without a summer, that Mary Shelley began Frankenstein. The creature born of scientific hubris and isolation was itself conceived in isolation, forged in the unnatural cold. Outside their literary bubble, local villagers resented the foreigners' luxuries. Gossip traveled fast, foreigners burning excess candles while the townspeople scraped together dung for fire. There were mutterings of curses, of sin, of unnatural experiments. What the guests wrote became immortal. But what the peasants did digging trenches to keep water from flooding barley fields, burning peat when wood was gone, was forgotten. The price of bread. As crops failed, markets adjusted. The price of rye in Saxony doubled. In Ireland, oats became unaffordable. Food riots broke out across parts of the German Confederation. Bakers were targeted, merchants accused of hoarding. In some towns, grain was guarded by local militia. In others, it was quietly exported to wealthier areas. An English newspaper wrote in August 1816, There is no corn in the countryside. The mills are silent and the people quiet but not calm. In America, frost returned again and again. Snow fell in Boston in July. Thomas Jefferson recorded in his letters the damage to his Monticello crops. Migrants began leaving New England in droves, heading west to what they hoped would be more reliable land. This migration would, in time, shape the development of the American Midwest. Cold and cholera. The cold, paradoxically, allowed diseases to flourish. Sanitation was poor, and the wet ground invited sickness. In urban areas, there was a rise in respiratory infections and dysentery. In Bengal, India, thousands of miles from the chill, cholera began to spread in waves that would later circle the globe. There's little drama in the spread of disease when it's slow and uneven, yet the death tolls were no less tragic. One local French priest wrote, "There are more funerals than marriages now. Bobbies are buried without names. The church bell rings with a cold echo." A global ripple. The Tambora eruption didn't just change Europe, it altered the course of history across continents. In China's Yunnan province, cold destroyed rice crops and led to mass starvation. In parts of Indonesia and India, the monsoon failed. The world was colder, yes, but also more unstable. And still, most people simply adjusted. They wore extra layers if they had them. They stored what little they could, and they hoped. A candle in the gray. In many villages, the evening candle was a ritual. People gathered early not for warmth but for companionship. Stories were told, knitting done. Some practiced silent prayer, others just listened to the wind. In a year when even summer failed to arrive, it was these mundane rituals that defined endurance. The summer of 1816 had already betrayed the hopes of spring, but as the year trudged into its latter months, the true consequences began to unfurl. This wasn't just a bad season, it was a systemic breakdown of rhythms that had guided human life for generations. Across continents, decisions made in dusty town halls and over rough-hewn farmhouse tables reflected the same question. What do we do if the cold never leaves? You sit now in your one-room cottage, layered in wool and quiet. The calendar says August, but your bones say otherwise. The air is still, the fog thick. The harvest you once prayed for has become a concept, not a certainty. And in nearby villages, rumors begin to whisper about entire families leaving, some by cart, some on foot, heading west or south toward a summer that might still exist. Emigration and the search for fertile ground. One of the more understated consequences of the year without a summer was its influence on human geography. In North America, particularly in the northeastern United States and parts of eastern Canada, entire families made the decision to uproot and resettle. From Vermont and New Hampshire, thousands moved westward into Ohio, Indiana, and even as far as Illinois. These regions, still frontier territory at the time, held promise not just of land but of stability. Why move? Not because of famine alone, but because of unpredictability. One farmer from New Hampshire wrote in his journal, "The seeds do not sprout. The grass is sickly. We must find another place or we shall dig our own graves here." This was not a dramatic exodus but a slow, relentless trickle. Wagon wheels creaked along muddy trails. Livestock were herded with hopes they would survive the journey. Most had no illusions of luxury. The new land might not be better, it might only be different. Economic distress and policy paralysis. Governments of the time were largely unprepared. Few had the infrastructure to handle widespread famine or economic disruption. Grain reserves were minimal, and transportation networks were primitive. In Britain, the end of the Napoleonic Wars meant an influx of returning soldiers and a sharp economic downturn. The price of bread surged. Unemployment rose. In Ireland, where poverty was already chronic, food insecurity turned into open suffering. In Germany, the word Hunger, our hunger year, began appearing in newspapers. Some relief programs were initiated. In parts of Switzerland, communal bakeries distributed thin bread rations. In Württemberg, southern Germany, Duke Wilhelm attempted to control grain prices and imported food at great expense. But these were stopgaps, not solutions. Taxes, paradoxically, were not eased. Many households owed payments to local landlords or state authorities even as their fields failed. Debt climbed. Protests flickered but rarely flamed. The people were simply too tired. The quiet toll on culture. While most historical attention goes to grand axe revolutions, treaties, wars, the year without a summer chipped away at the cultural soul in quieter ways. Festivals were canceled, markets delayed, weddings postponed. In some alpine villages, religious processions were held almost weekly, hoping divine intervention might clear the skis. The paintings of the period grew darker in hue. Landscape artists depicted gray mountains and withered trees. Writers adopted a tone of melancholy. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, then in Weimar, noted in a letter, "Even the river seems unsure of its direction. The days do not pass, they simply fade." In a small town in Austria, the local bell tower chimed half an hour later than usual, not from sabotage, but because the timekeeper had given up trying to find the sun for calibration. Crisis in the food chain. It wasn't just humans who suffered. Animals, too, bore the brunt of the cold and hunger. Oxen, typically strong and reliable labor animals, grew thin and sluggish. Horses perished or were slaughtered for food. Chickens stopped laying. Wolves in some areas became bold and desperate, attacking livestock and even isolated travelers. This collapse in the food chain had compounding effects. With fewer animals, plowing slowed. With fewer eggs and milk, nutrition worsened. And with more desperation came theft, not violent but persistent. In Bavaria, records show a dramatic increase in what were called hunger crimes. The theft of turnips, bread, or even bundles of hay. Punishment was often harsh, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Communities teetered on a thin edge, and one family's theft was another's famine. Medical and psychological effects. Doctors were baffled. They treated symptoms: fatigue, cough, dizziness, bloated bellies. But they lacked the frameworks to understand vitamin deficiency, malnutrition, or cold-induced depression. A French physician wrote, "I see no disease, yet I see illness. The people are weary. Their color is pale, their steps are unsure. They do not cry out, they simply endure." Modern historians now recognize that the gloomy weather, poor diet, and lack of sunlight contributed to widespread seasonal affective disorders, though unnamed at the time. Alcohol use rose. So too did suicide, though these were rarely recorded or discussed. In towns where winter had always been seen as a season of rest and preparation, the cold now overstayed its welcome. It was no longer a pause, it had become a wait. Religious reactions and millenarian beliefs. Some saw the endless gray as divine punishment. Others believed it was a sign of the apocalypse. In New England, religious revivals surged. Camp meetings and outdoor sermons became common again. Preachers warned of judgment and called for repentance. Some interpreted the crop failures and red-tinted sunsets as omens from Revelation. In Europe, apocalyptic pamphlets were circulated, not widely but enough to stir unease. One broadside in Saxony predicted that the world would end on October 13, 1816. When it didn't, there was no laughter, only more waiting. These beliefs weren't always fringe. They shaped behavior. Some families refused to plant crops again, convinced that the world would end before harvest. Others sold possessions, paid off spiritual debts, or attempted to make amends with estranged family. A kind of fatalism crept in, not loud, but enduring. New habits and long-term shifts. Despite the hardship, people adapted in subtle ways. New crops. Some communities began experimenting with hardier crops like turnips and oats. Preservation techniques. Salting, pickling, and drying became more widespread, even in homes that had not previously practiced them. Communal storage. In some Swiss cantons, new bylaws required grain to be stored collectively and distributed during hardship. Weather diaries. More people began keeping daily logs of weather, planting times, and outcomes, an early precursor to agricultural science. These quiet shifts would shape how communities approached future uncertainty. While many did not survive the crisis, those who did left behind a culture marked by caution, adaptation, and documentation. The unseen deaths. Not all victims of 1816 were counted. Some froze, some starved, some slipped away in illness or despair. In the absence of large-scale war or pestilence, there was no collective mourning, no monuments to the unnamed, only church records, faded ink, and the occasional mention in a diary. In a Swiss parish registry from late 1816, an entry reads simply, "Maria E., age 9, died quietly. The ground was too hard for burial." The cold, as it always does, eventually began to lift. But when the first true spring arrived in 1817, the world it warmed was not the same. The people had changed. The land had changed. And though the skies were clearer, the imprint of the year without a summer remained in every frayed blanket, every field left fallow, every family name that vanished from the parish rolls. You now rise with the sun, its golden light unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable after months of pale gray. The goats bleat with more life. There are buds on the wild raspberries. And still, you hesitate, because you know deep in your bones how fragile the balance has become. This is the quiet story of survival, and how it echoes long after the snow melts. The winter that lasted a year. By early 1817, the sulfuric veil in the stratosphere had begun to dissipate. The skies, after almost 18 months of subdued sunlight, gradually regained clarity. Temperatures rebounded not dramatically, but enough for the return of functional growing seasons in much of Europe and North America. The recovery was inconsistent. Some regions planted cautiously. Others, particularly in the northeastern U.S. and parts of Ireland, suffered continued food insecurity into the next 2 years due to depleted seed stores and livestock losses. Still, there was a sense of return, a cautious optimism. Bread became a little thicker. Firewood, long hoarded, could now be used freely again, and yet trust in the weather, in the land, and in routine was slow to return. Migration that reshaped nations. In the United States, the migration from New England to the Midwest that began during the 1816 famine became a sustained movement. Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois saw rapid population growth over the following decade. Fertile soil, lower land prices, and the memory of failed crops in the East created a powerful incentive. This shift helped form the agricultural backbone of the American interior. Small towns grew along rivers and trails, forming a chain of settlements that would feed into the broader national economy by the mid-19th century. In Europe, the patterns were subtler. Some rural families moved toward cities. Others turned to emigration to Prussia, to the Low Countries, to the Americas. The disruption pushed individuals to seek stability elsewhere, planting the seeds of future diaspora communities. Seeds of scientific curiosity. Though few understood the atmospheric science behind 1816's strange climate, the abnormal weather did not go unnoticed by early thinkers. In England, amateur meteorologists began comparing weather journals, looking for patterns. In Geneva, Horace Bénédict de Saussure's legacy of atmospheric observation inspired a generation of alpine scholars to collect data. The volcanic cause would not be properly connected until decades later, but the appetite for explanation began here in puzzled scribbles and regional weather maps. By the mid-19th century, scientists had begun correlating volcanic eruptions with climate anomalies. Tambora became a case study. The eruption that killed tens of thousands in Indonesia and chilled the world was now part of the growing science of climatology. A cultural residue. The legacy of the cold year was not just agricultural or migrational, it was deeply cultural. Literature, art, and even religious thought were touched by the pall of 1816. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, born in the gloom of Lake Geneva, reflected not only scientific anxiety but isolation, unnatural conditions, and the boundaries of survival. J.M.W. Turner's landscape paintings in subsequent years reflected the lingering haziness of the atmosphere, reds and yellows, made more intense by volcanic dust still present in the stratosphere. Folklore shifted. In alpine villages, legends began to speak of a sunless summer, a test sent from the heavens, or a punishment for forgetting the old ways. Churches recorded a modest increase in baptisms and marriages once the cold receded, almost as if people were resuming a paused life. Even today, the term Hungerjahr remains a quiet echo in some parts of Germany and Switzerland. New policies from old pain. The year without a summer forced many regional authorities to reconsider their food security policies. Although centralized disaster management was still far off, small steps were taken. Communal granaries were established in certain German duchies. Crop diversification became more common. Reliance on monocultures, particularly oats and rye, was seen as risky. Local seed banks quietly formed through informal bartering and regional cooperation. In Britain, the economic crisis contributed indirectly to political agitation. Though the connection was slow and diffuse, the social unrest of the 1820s can, in part, be traced to the exhaustion and economic hardship rooted in the failed crops of 1816. Memory and forgetting. Strangely, though, the year without a summer faded from public consciousness faster than expected. Because it wasn't a war or a revolution, there were few monuments. Because it didn't have a single villain, there was no narrative. Because the suffering was slow and quiet, it didn't lend itself to legend, only to family stories, local tales, and forgotten footnotes. It would take more than a century before climate historians and volcanologists would truly revisit Tambora's global legacy. Today, we know that it may have caused over 100,000 deaths globally, both directly and through starvation and disease. But at the time, it was just a bad year, an odd year, a cruel joke from the skis, and people, as always, moved on. Survival as routine. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of 1816 was how ordinary people survived without glory. By eating less and sharing more. By bartering instead of hoarding. By walking instead of waiting. By believing not necessarily in hope, but in tomorrow. It was not survival as triumph, but survival as default, as duty. This was not a year remembered for its events, but for its atmosphere, its cold, its stillness, and for the thousands of lives that quietly endured it. Final reflection. In the silence of cold and the absence of summer, people did not write grand declarations. They built fires, they boiled roots, and they waited. What then truly defines resilience? Is it the victories we recount, or the quiet persistence we forget to record? Story 2. Frozen front mail couriers of the Siberian Post Roads. There are places in the world where winter doesn't come, it simply never leaves. Siberia is one of those places. In the 18th and 19th centuries, long before the telegraph and the railroad came rumbling across the taiga, there were the couriers. Solitary men tasked with keeping the Russian Empire connected, one icy mile at a time. You are one of them now. The leather pouch across your chest contains imperial correspondence, dry, unremarkable, vital. Your sleigh is light, your horse tired, and the only sounds are the creak of wooden runners and the occasional howl in the distance. The temperature, perhaps degrees C, but you've long since stopped measuring. Out here, distance and cold are the only real facts. This is the forgotten frontier of communication where time moved slower, and every letter delivered was a minor miracle. The vastness of Siberia. To understand the story of the Siberian Post couriers, one must first grasp the scale of the land. Siberia, covering over 13 million square kilometers, stretches across 7 time zones. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, it was a realm of isolation, exile, and resource extraction. Yet the Russian Empire needed to project presence and maintain control, and that required something surprisingly mundane: dependable mail service. The Great Siberian tracked the main overland route ran from Moscow to Irkutsk and later extended all the way to the Pacific coast. It was not a road in the modern sense. It was a patchwork of dirt tracks, frozen rivers, and seasonal trails. And it was along this frozen artery that men like you mail couriers known as yamshchiks traveled. Who were the couriers? Couriers were often peasant men, recruited or compelled into service. Others were Cossacks or semi-retired soldiers. Some chose the life, seeking escape from debts or family disgrace. A few were locals Evenki or Buryats who knew the terrain better than any map. Their job: move mail across a vast wilderness in all seasons, particularly winter, when frozen rivers made travel marginally faster. They traveled by sleigh, horseback, or on foot. A courier could cover up to 100 kilometers a day in ideal conditions, but in the depths of a Siberian blizzard, that distance could shrink to 10 or none at all. There were no hotels, no telegraph lines to report delays. Only a chain of Yamsky Stanzii post stations scattered like faint stars across a bleak landscape. The post stations, cold hospitality. At intervals of 30 to 50 kilometers, couriers found rest at post stations. These stations were crude log structures, warmed by wood stoves and manned by attendants who offered basic meals and new horses. Each station kept a small stable, some dried hay, and occasionally a few spare sleighs. In theory, they were to be resupplied by the state. In practice, they operated on barter, local taxes, and the generosity or fear of passing nobles. Conditions were variable. Some stations were havens offering porridge, warmth, even crude cots. Others were drafty and infested with lice. In winter, the stables often offered more heat than the main rooms. It was not uncommon for couriers to sleep alongside their horses. You'd arrive exhausted, frostbitten, and hoarse. You'd leave again before dawn, knowing another 40 kilometers of frozen track awaited. Weather as enemy. The greatest hazard was not wolves, nor thieves, but the cold itself. Siberian winters could see temperatures fall below degrees C in some regions. Frostbite was a constant threat. Hands, ears, toes all vulnerable. To travel at night was often a gamble. The sky clear, the stars cruel, the frost creeping into joints and boots. Couriers wrapped themselves in layers of felt, wool, and fur. Reindeer hide was prized, as it retained warmth even when stiff with ice. Yet nothing fully prevented the cold from seeping in. The only strategy was movement. Stop for too long and death was quick. Frost fog was common crystals suspended in the air, glittering by moonlight, obscuring everything. One 1812 traveler wrote, "I saw a man walking beside his sleigh, stiff as a post, the reins frozen to his hand. He had not noticed his own death." This was no exaggeration. The burden of paper. Despite the danger, the mail had to move. Imperial edicts, census data, tax records, military orders, these were the lifeblood of governance in distant provinces. If mail stopped, so did the empire's reach. Many letters were dull. Inventories of grain shipments, reports on timber licenses, parish records. Yet these tiny scraps of bureaucracy held real power. There were also personal letters between families separated by exile, or merchants in Irkutsk sending payments to Moscow. Love letters, business deals, accusations all wrapped in wax-sealed envelopes. To lose a pouch of mail was no small failure. A courier could be fined, whipped, or dismissed. In cases of negligence, imprisonment. In rare instances, if theft was suspected, they could face execution. Some chose to hide letters rather than risk frostbite. Others buried their pouches if pursued by wolves or thieves, retrieving them days later if they survived. But most, somehow, delivered what was entrusted to them. Wolves, thieves, and solitude. Though the cold was the primary danger, other threats lurked. Wolves roamed the forests in winter, bolder when hunger drove them. Tales of lone sleighs found empty but blood-stained are part folklore, part fact. Bandits sometimes haunted the routes, especially in regions where law was a distant rumor. A courier's pouch might not hold gold, but knowledge about troop movements, tax rates, or names had its own currency. Solitude was a subtler foe. Days could pass without seeing another soul. The unbroken whiteness of the taiga, the endless creaking of wood, could wear on the mind. Some couriers sang or muttered constantly. Others developed rituals tying charms to sleighs, never saying certain words aloud, or tossing bits of bread to the side of the road as offerings. A few went mad, more simply disappeared. Routine of survival. And yet there was rhythm. Wake before light. Wrap feet in dry cloth. Feed the horse if oats are left. Check the straps, touch the letters, reassure yourself. Move. At post stations, some couriers left marks or messages for one another. Warnings of bad ice, notes about wolves, or simply a carved symbol to say, "I made it this far." There was pride in the work, not for glory, but for purpose. The empire depended on your quiet, invisible movement. No one applauded your arrival, but if you failed, people noticed. The mail must move forward. That was the unwritten rule. Not because the empire demanded it with loud proclamations, but because, in the great silence of Siberia, the mail was the only thing that did move. In a land without telegraphs, without railroads, often without even fixed roads, a courier on the winter trail became the single thread tying the periphery to the center. As you pass another milepost half buried in snow, its wood weathered, you notice the change in the wind. It's biting from the north now. The horse pulls against the harness. There's no sound but hooves in the crusted snow and the breath of animals and man alike, puffing out in short, resigned bursts. Your destination is still a day's ride away, but the letters under your coat are warm from your chest. It's not your name on the seal, but it is your burden. The imperial network, control at a distance. The Tsar's court in St. Petersburg ruled a vast empire whose edges reached the Pacific. For governors, generals, tax collectors, and bishops spread across Siberia, mail delivery was their only link to central authority. The YAM system, Russia's medieval courier network, had evolved over time. By the 18th century, it resembled a patchy but vital circulatory system. Though stretched thin, it remained functional thanks to men and horses who could endure what machines never could. Each courier carried more than physical documents. They carried information, and information, in the 19th century, meant power. Orders issued in the capital could take weeks or even months to reach their destination. This delay often meant that regional administrators exercised considerable autonomy. Still, the mail ensured that someone was watching. Reports sent, responses awaited. Delay bred suspicion, silence bred punishment. The burden of bureaucracy. Most letters transported across Siberia were not dramatic. They were inventory lists from timber yards, delivery manifests from salt caravans, legal summons, and tax assessments. Some were part of massive land surveys, tracking how many households could be taxed, drafted, or moved. Census documents were particularly important. The Russian Empire's need to count and categorize its people became more urgent after each war, famine, or rebellion. Church records, detailing births, marriages, and deaths, were copied and forwarded to regional centers, handwritten pages wrapped in linen and wax sealed. Military orders, often marked with urgency, sometimes bore dual copies, one for the governor, one for the commanding officer in Irkutsk or Yakutsk. To the couriers, these packets all looked the same, but occasionally the pouch carried secrets. Sealed envelopes marked with a red string indicated state intelligence. Such letters were never to be opened, dropped, or delayed. If lost, the courier would be presumed guilty until proven otherwise. In the archives of the Russian State Historical Library, one record from 1824 describes a post rider drowned while attempting to cross the Lena River on thinning ice, mail pouch recovered by locals, contents classified, courier's name unknown. Even in death, the message arrived. The role of the local populace. The courier's world was shaped not only by snow and wind, but also by the people along the route. Peasants bound by obligation to the state were required to support couriers with food, hay, and shelter at designated stations. Known as Podorozhny Povinnost, travel duty, it was a heavy burden in poor villages. Station masters, often retired soldiers or minor officials, were responsible for logbooks tracking each passing courier, the mail they carried, and the condition of their sleigh or horse. Innkeepers near major junctions offered better shelter for a price. Letters might rest beneath a stove, warmed and safe, as their bearers sipped hot kvass and bandaged cracked hands. Though the courier was usually treated with deference, especially when bearing imperial seals, he was also a reminder of the state's constant presence, always watching, always taxing, always writing back. Voices from the trail. Letters from this era occasionally mention the couriers not by name, but by presence. Your last letter came late. The man who brought it looked half dead and said nothing. I gave him bread and he moved on. A Merchant's Wife, Tobolsk, 1817. The postman said he saw wolves by the frozen lake again. He carries a pistol now. They took a horse last month. A Priest, Perm, 1821. Our station is without oats. The men cannot go further until spring. Please send more fuel. Station Master, near Krasnoyarsk. There was no praise in these mentions. Just the fact of the courier's existence, another component of the empire, trudging through the snow. Mail in times of crisis. Mail took on special significance during times of upheaval. Famine, when crops failed in the southern steppes or the Urals, supply requests and population tallies surged. Couriers became lifelines, reporting village conditions to the capital. Rebellion. In 1825, during the Decembrist revolt, several exiled nobles were sent east by mail, not just letters, but men themselves. Couriers delivered not only words but prisoners. War. During Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, mail traffic westward was suspended. But within Siberia, it increased, tracking recruits, collecting resources, and sending warnings to distant outposts in case the war expanded. Even in moments of global change, the empire demanded documentation, and couriers, cold and unseen, ensured it was written and received. Perils beyond weather. We often romanticize dangers of the open wilderness: wolves, snowstorms, treacherous rivers, but many of the greatest threats were mundane. Exhaustion. Many couriers collapsed mid-route from sheer fatigue. Malnutrition. With few provisions and long distances between stations, scurvy and weight loss were common. Illness. There was no medicine along the trail. Fever meant delay. Delay meant suspicion. Corruption. Some stations sold horses meant for couriers, replacing them with sick animals or none at all. Bribes were common but not always effective. A postal directive from 1809 warned, "Let the courier not be hindered by petty delay. To delay the word of the empire is to weaken the empire." But couriers were often delayed, and weakened and forgotten. The courier's internal world. After weeks or months alone on the trail, many couriers began to develop what modern psychologists might call coping rituals. Some carried icon cards, religious images they would pin to the sleigh. Others recited psalms or folk songs, or the names of their children over and over. Some created maps in their heads, mental landmarks to count progress. The crooked birch, the frozen stream with black water beneath. Most didn't speak of these practices, they simply did them. In the margins of one postal ledger from 1833, a note scribbled by a courier reads, "If I do not arrive, the letter is with the birch tree that splits at the top. By the hill of bones, tell my brother." We don't know if he was ever found. The road east curves along a narrow ridge where frost clings to every surface like ash. Your horse slows, nostrils flaring, sensing something ahead. But there is nothing, no village, no shelter, no warmth. Only the road, the snow, and the pouch under your coat. This is the final stretch. The mail must reach Irkutsk by nightfall. And still, the cold presses in, not just on your skin, but on your thoughts. Why continue? Why push forward when no one will remember your name? When the only reward is a new pouch of letters and the journey reversed? Because, for the couriers of the Siberian tract, movement was purpose. And stopping meant vanishing like snow upon firewood, melted and gone before anyone asked where you'd gone. Discipline of the route, the final leg. The final portion of a courier's route was never a triumph. No one greeted them with ceremony or accolades. They arrived hunched, silent, frost-rimed, handed off their pouch at the regional administrative office, and were either given another or allowed to rest. At larger towns like Tomsk, Krasnoyarsk, or Irkutsk, the post system operated at a slightly higher level of organization. Regional mail managers, often ex-military, inspected documents for damage, verified station logs, and questioned couriers about road conditions. A missing page or seal could result in suspicion. Still, for those who delivered reliably, there was a quiet respect, not spoken but understood. Some of the most trusted couriers were granted longer routes, sealed correspondence, or even privileges like a warm bed and a boiled egg at the better stations. These small luxuries were hard-earned currency. But even the best couriers aged quickly. Most did not remain in service more than 10 years. Their bodies could not withstand it. The disappearance of men. There were no national honors for dead couriers, no monuments, but records show their frequent disappearance. In 1822, near the Yenisei River, a courier vanished between two post stations. His horse returned alone, the saddle loose. No mail was recovered. In 1839, 3 couriers were found frostbitten to death in their sleigh, letters still inside their coats. A sudden whiteout storm had swallowed them. They froze upright. In 1851, wolves were found scavenging the remains of a sleigh near the Lena. The courier's pouch had been torn open. Some letters survived, buried in snow. Others were lost forever. Most of these disappearances were noted in the logs with cold brevity. Did not arrive, presumed dead, pouch unrecovered. Sometimes their families were notified if they had one, sometimes not. And yet replacements always came. A vanishing role in a changing empire. By the mid to late 19th century, the courier's role began to shift. The telegraph, introduced in Russia in the 1850s, slowly replaced the urgency of long-distance mail for government use. Steamships began to service the rivers in warmer months. The Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1891, would one day make the overland route largely obsolete. But these were still decades away for many. For much of the 19th century, especially in eastern Siberia, the human courier remained indispensable. Still, their status eroded. The state focused more on efficiency, less on endurance. The romance of the road, such as it was, never really existed outside of fiction. What replaced it was bureaucracy. By the 1880s, the yamschik was just another part of the machinery now being replaced by wires and wheels. Echoes in fiction and memory. Oddly, while the couriers themselves were rarely remembered, they appeared in Russian literature as background figures, messengers, sleigh drivers, shadowy presences crossing blizzards with unseen burdens. In Pushkin's and Gogol's tales, the post road appears often, dotted with tired men and windswept voices. Tolstoy references the distances mail must travel, though rarely the men who travel it. In Soviet-era textbooks, the yamschiks were recast as humble heroes of czarist inefficiency, stoic workers in an unkind empire. But these depictions rarely grasped the full solitude of the work. They celebrated service but not suffering, movement but not memory. One real courier, Stepan Kovalov, left behind a rare personal journal, written between 1853–1861. In it, he wrote, "I have delivered 912 pouches. I have crossed the Angara frozen and thawed. I have seen wolves twice and buried comrades 4 times. My name is not known to any man of importance, but I have never lost a letter." His record ends abruptly, no final entry. A legacy written in snow. Today, the path of the old Great Siberian Tract is overlaid by highways, rail lines, and cities. Some of the old post stations have been converted into museums, others left to rot, reclaimed by moss and snow. The couriers themselves have no graves with markers. Many died in the wild, unclaimed, unnamed. But their impact endures in census data preserved, military orders delivered, families reunited through letters, and the quiet expansion of a state that depended utterly on being able to send and receive. For all the Tsar's declarations, all the bureaucratic power in St. Petersburg, the empire rested partly on men with frostbitten hands and cracked lips, guiding sleighs under stars across frozen silence. Final reflection. If the only proof of your life's work is that a message arrived without fanfare, without delay, without loss, was that not a kind of greatness? And if so, why are such men never remembered by name? Story 3. Harsh measures surviving the Great Frost of 1709. On the morning of January 6, 1709, the city of Paris awoke to a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The Seine had frozen solid overnight. Birds lay stiff in the streets, their wings coated in frost. Fires, kept burning through the night, had been extinguished by the creeping cold that seeped through stone walls and iron grates. It was not just a cold day. It was the beginning of something far worse. You stir in the dark, not from waking but from failing to sleep. There is no warmth, not in the hearth, not in your fingers, not in your thoughts. The cold sits in your chest like a stone. You are a farmer, a merchant, a servant, it doesn't matter. In this moment, all lives are equal in the eyes of the frost. This is the great winter, and it has just begun. The cold that came without warning. In meteorological terms, the Great Frost of 1709 is considered the coldest European winter in the past 500 years. Temperatures dropped precipitously across France, the Low Countries, Germany, and parts of Italy and Spain. But it was not just the cold that struck, it was the speed and scale. Paris recorded temperatures of -23 degrees C. In Augsburg, Germany, the thermometer dipped to degrees C. In Milan, olive trees centuries old froze and cracked open. Water in ink bottles solidified indoors. Wine froze in barrels. Doors warped shut. And in many places, even the bread, when there was any, had to be thawed before it could be cut. The cause? A confluence of cold Arctic air, unusually still atmospheric conditions, and the already ongoing cooling trend of the Little Ice Age. But to the people of 1709, there was no explanation, only punishment. Some believed it was divine retribution for war. Others feared sorcery or signs of the end times. What they did not know was that survival would require more than prayer. It would require decisions, compromises, and often cruel measures. Life in France, a failing monarchy meets frozen fields. France, under Louis XIV, was already suffering from years of war, taxation, and failed harvests. The War of the Spanish Succession had drained the treasury, and the countryside was riddled with discontent. The winter of 1709 turned hardship into catastrophe. Across the countryside, grain froze in granaries and wheat in the ground perished under ice-crusted soil. Even hardy crops like rye and barley suffered. Peasants, already surviving on bread made of husks and acorns, found their options vanishing. Famine did not wait until spring. It began in January. Wood, now rare and expensive, was hoarded by landowners. In cities, poor families burned furniture, animal dung, or rags soaked in fat. Entire forests were stripped of limbs for kindling. In Paris, people tore up floorboards in abandoned houses. They roasted dead rats, ground bones for soup, and scraped wax from cathedral candles. The price of bread quadrupled. Bakers were mobbed. Riots flickered quickly and desperately crushed. Yet the court at Versailles, shielded by privilege, continued its ceremonies, even as icicles formed along the inner galleries. Louis XIV ordered more furs but otherwise changed little. When asked about starving provinces, he reportedly replied, "They have endured worse." Perhaps, but not many survived it. Rural struggles, death in the silence. In the countryside, the situation was worse. Livestock froze where they stood. Farmers awoke to find their pigs dead in their pens, cows stiff in their barns. With no animals, there would be no planting come spring. The rivers froze, halting the transport of grain, salt, and firewood. Mill wheels stood still, grinding ceased. In many regions, people ground bark or weeds to stretch their flour. Orchards perished. In Normandy, entire apple groves died overnight. In the Loire Valley, vineyards collapsed. The wine harvest would not return to normal for over a decade. The death toll was staggering. In France alone, it's estimated that over 600,000 people died from cold, hunger, or disease in 1709 and the following year. That number, while rarely discussed in textbooks, places the event among the worst European catastrophes of the pre-industrial era. Still, the peasantry endured. They had no choice. Cold without shelter, the urban poor. Cities like Lyon, Marseille, and Rouen were overwhelmed. Charitable orders tried to respond, but their soup kitchens ran dry within weeks. In Paris, hospitals overflowed. Corpses lined alleyways. Orphans huddled in graveyards for shelter. Begging laws were suspended in some cities out of necessity. There were too many, and prisons were full. Municipal records show spikes in deaths not from illness or injury, but from simple exposure. "Frozen in place" was a common phrase. The cold reshaped urban rhythms. Streets fell silent. Markets were empty. Bells rang slower, muffled by snow and ice. It was not uncommon for entire families to go missing, found days later, huddled together under collapsed roofs or in burned-out shacks. Responses from the elite, charity or strategy. Some nobles did attempt to help. In Burgundy, the Duke of Nevers ordered his estate cellars open to distribute grain. In Brittany, local monks prepared soup en masse. In Provence, some wealthy landowners allowed peasants to collect firewood from their forests without punishment, a radical act of mercy at the time. But others saw the winter as opportunity. Grain merchants hoarded supplies, waiting for prices to peak. Landowners acquired failing farms at a discount. The poor grew poorer, the rich often richer. In Versailles, the court murmured about divine wrath, yet policy remained largely unchanged. Taxes were not eased, conscription continued, and no national relief system existed. This was a winter survived not through governance, but through improvisation and cruelty. Northern and Eastern Europe, a shared suffering. The cold was not confined to France. In Germany, the Elbe and Rhine froze solid. Citizens walked across rivers where ships had once sailed. In Poland and Lithuania, thousands of peasants perished before February. In some villages, entire populations vanished. In Sweden, the army under Charles XII, then invading Ukraine, was devastated. Over 2,000 soldiers froze to death in a single week. This loss contributed directly to Sweden's failure in the Great Northern War, a pivotal moment in Eastern European history. In Italy, citrus orchards in Naples were lost. Fish perished in canals. Venice saw its lagoon freeze. The frost was everywhere. The silence of it settled like a second snowfall. Disease and desperation. Starvation weakens the body, cold kills it, and into this vacuum stepped disease. Typhus spread through shelters and poorhouses. Dysentery swept cities with contaminated snowmelt. In some areas, smallpox resurfaced more deadly among those already starving. Families faced impossible decisions. Should they eat the seed grain meant for planting, sell a child into service for food, abandon an elder who could no longer walk? In Lyon, a priest recorded, "A man brought his daughter to the church asking that she be taken in. She was not ill, only hungry. When we returned the next day, he had died in the square." There are hundreds of such stories. Most were never written down. End of section 1. Thought. What happens when the very seasons betray us, when the world offers no warmth, no harvest, no reprieve? In the Great Frost of 1709, the answer was written not in victories, but in who chose to look away and who did not. The snow did not melt with the arrival of spring. Not truly. In many parts of Europe, the ground remained frozen until April. When the thaw came, it brought not warmth but ruin. Flooded fields, rotting food stores, disease-bearing runoff. The cruel paradox of the Great Frost was that survival in the winter did not guarantee survival after it. You stand in a field with a broken spade and a bag of spoiled seed. The ground is soft but sour, the furrows shallow. Your neighbor died last week. His field lies untouched. You think about planting it too, but the question gnaws at you. Is there any point in sowing if nothing grows? This was the grim arithmetic of 1709. How to survive a year with no resources, no government relief, and no promise of a better harvest. It was a test of endurance but also of ethics, and the answers were rarely noble. The collapse of rural life. When winter finally released its grip, it left behind something worse, a vacuum. Cattle had been slaughtered, either out of necessity or because they froze. With no animals to plow, fields remained unturned. Seed grain had been eaten. Desperation made long-term thinking irrelevant. Tools were broken or sold for firewood or food. No one had money. Barter became king. In central France and southern Germany, villages began to depopulate. Entire families left their land, wandering in search of food, employment, or charity. Some walked for days to cities, only to find themselves rejected at the gates. Others became squatters, setting up makeshift camps near monasteries, rivers, or abandoned estates. Hunger transformed them from farmers to refugees. Local records from Lorraine note 27 unknown persons buried this month. No parish claim, possibly of the road. The road people, as they came to be called, were everywhere, and they frightened those who remained behind. The birth of grain riots. In towns and cities across France, Germany, and the Low Countries, grain riots became a recurring response to famine. These were not coordinated rebellions, but eruptions of collective panic, the common triggers. Rumors of hoarding by merchants or nobles. Sightings of grain carts being exported while locals starved. Price spikes beyond the reach of the working class. In Paris, Riots broke out in March 1709 when it was discovered that bread shipments from provincial mills were being sent to Versailles first. In Rouen, a baker was dragged from his shop and beaten to death by a crowd. In Liege, entire warehouses were ransacked. Authorities responded with swift violence. Troops were called in. Dozens were hanged as examples, but the desperation persisted. One judge in Flanders wrote, "These are not crimes of theft, but of necessity, yet the gallows swings all the same." Cannibalism and the taboo. Perhaps the darkest reality of the Great Frost was this. In some places, hunger eroded even the deepest social taboos. While most historical records treat the subject delicately, scattered reports, some whispered, others official, suggest that cannibalism occurred. In the region of Champagne, officials documented the arrest of 2 men who had exhumed bodies from a parish graveyard for meat. In Bohemia, a midwife was tried for preparing human broth during the famine. In southern Poland, a village priest recorded in his diary, "A child went missing. The neighbors speak only in silence now." These incidents were isolated, but real. They underscore the extremity of the suffering and the moral collapse that starvation can produce. Still, most did not resort to such horrors. They shared, rationed, begged, and buried their dead. But the rumors persisted, making fear part of the famine. Disease becomes the harvest. With no clean water and little food, epidemics spread rapidly. The combination of weakened bodies, overcrowding in cities, and spring floods created a perfect environment for disease. Typhus returned with a vengeance in many parts of France and Germany. Dysentery killed thousands in refugee camps, especially among children. Smallpox flared again in rural Italy and Hungary, taking advantage of undernourished populations. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Clergy could not keep up with funerals. In some towns, mass graves were dug and covered quickly. Entire parish registries from 1709, 1710 show gaps where no names are listed, just a number. In one village near Mainz, a priest recorded, "We ring the bell for the living now, not the dead. The dead have become too many." The church and the question of blame. Religion played a central role in both explanation and response. Some priests called the frost divine punishment for sin, sloth, or heresy. In France, sermons denounced luxury and moral decay. Others preached charity, urging the wealthy to give more and the poor to stay hopeful. The church was often the only organized relief provider. Pilgrimages resumed in some areas, with barefoot travelers walking to shrines or holy wells in the hope of invoking divine mercy. But belief wavered. Some turned away from the church, angry at the silence or hypocrisy. In Protestant regions, ministers struggled to reconcile theology with the scale of suffering. Why would God allow such cruelty? This crisis of faith would echo for years afterward, subtly fueling secular thought and early Enlightenment skepticism. Children of the Frost. The most enduring victims of the Great Frost were its youngest. Entire cohorts of children suffered stunted growth, cognitive delays, or died outright. In historical demographic records, birth rates plummeted in 1709, 1710 across Western Europe. Many marriages were postponed. Infants born during the famine were more likely to die within their first year. In some regions, foundling homes overflowed. Parents unable to feed another mouth left infants at church steps or monastery doors. In Vienna, the city reported more than 3,000 abandoned infants in a single year. Those who survived would bear the physical and psychological scars of this event. They became a generation marked by lack of warmth, of food, of certainty. Whispers of reform. And yet, amidst the cold and silence, something shifted. Local administrators in France began calling for grain price regulations. Some German principalities started to establish emergency grain reserves rudimentary but foundational. In Italy, city councils experimented with public bread kitchens, open to all regardless of status. These were small, scattered responses. They did not end the suffering, but they hinted at a new idea, that perhaps governments should prepare for disaster, not just punish those who fail to survive it. It would take another century for the idea of national food security systems to take hold. But in 1709, the first thoughts flickered. The frost receded, not in a grand thaw but gradually, quietly, like a curtain pulled back from the edges. By midsummer, the roads were clear. The rivers flowed again. Trees began to bud reluctantly and patches of green returned to once white fields. Yet for many, this return of life came too late. Their houses were empty, their fields untended, their names forgotten. You now walk the same path you did before the frost, but your world has shrunk. Fewer voices, fewer lights in windows. The familiar smells of bread and damp earth have not returned. The cold may have lifted, but the memory of it lingers, pressed deep into your skin and your sleep. This is the final chapter of the Great Frost of 1709, not of the weather itself, but of what followed. Recovery did not arrive with the sun. It came slowly, unevenly, and not for everyone. The aftermath in numbers. By conservative estimates, between 600,000 and 1 million people perished across Europe as a result of the Great Frost and its consequences. In France alone, historians calculate that at least 5–7% of the population died. In northern Italy, records show a 30–40% reduction in wheat harvests in 1709, and again in 1710. In Germany, tax records from 1711 list entire villages with 0 taxable households dead or fled. In Poland and Hungary, absentee landlords returned to estates that had been abandoned. Animals gone, vineyards overgrown, buildings collapsed. The frost didn't just kill people, it erased economies, traditions, and entire communities. The population loss reshaped labor markets, disrupted trade, and triggered regional migrations that lasted well into the 1710s. Repopulation and resettlement. Governments, especially in the Holy Roman Empire and parts of Eastern Europe, responded to depopulation with incentivized resettlement. Nobles offered tax holidays to peasants willing to farm abandoned land. Some allowed previously unfree peasants to become hereditary tenants if they could restore productivity. In parts of Bohemia, foreign families were invited to settle, mainly from Bavaria or Austria, offered seed, tools, and religious tolerance in exchange for land reclamation. In France, the monarchy made no structural reforms but quietly forgave some tax debts in heavily affected regions. It was not generosity, but pragmatism. A dead peasant paid no taxes. This post-frost migration reshaped the rural map of Europe, quietly altering dialects, property ownership, and even religious boundaries in subtle ways. The long memory of hunger. The survivors carried with them, more than scars, they carried a new way of thinking. Families began hoarding grain from year to year, even in surplus seasons. Root vegetables, once considered peasant food, gained new respect for their frost resistance. Communities formed informal sharing networks, agreeing to pool grain or firewood during the next bad year. And perhaps most significantly, trust in centralized authority frayed. The belief that kings or bishops would protect their people weakened. This didn't yet become revolution, but it planted seeds of skepticism that the Enlightenment would later water. In rural sermons, priests spoke more of practical virtue, kindness, preparation, humility, and less of divine punishment. In private, many admitted they had no answers for the frost. Art and memory, the forgotten winter. Despite its scale, the Great Frost left few artistic or literary monuments. It was too grim, too undramatic. Misery had little narrative appeal in 18th-century Europe. but it can be glimpsed in fragments. In parish records, which abruptly spike in deaths and burials. In diaries of landowners, filled with sudden gaps and terse notes, nothing grew. In paintings, where winter scenes take on a duller tone after 1709, not cheerful skating parties, but still, gray landscapes and weary travelers. In one rural French church, a small fresco depicts the Madonna sheltering peasants from falling snow, added not in the Middle Ages, but in 1711, a quiet act of memory. But most remembered the frost orally, passing stories of Elhiver terrible to their children. Stories not of politics, but of cold beds, cracked hands, and decisions made in desperation. What changed and what did not? Did the Great Frost of 1709 change Europe? Yes, in ways that were slow and subtle. It nudged economies toward diversification. It encouraged communities to build reserves. It made philosophers and thinkers more skeptical of divine order. No, in that no monarch fell, no doctrine shifted overnight, no treaties were torn up because of it. It was a disaster endured rather than confronted. Its legacy was resilience, not revolution. But it did leave behind an imprint of caution, a kind of civilizational bruise. And though later generations would forget the frost itself, they would inherit the habits born from it. A new kind of survival. For those who lived through it, survival became a badge but not one of honor. It was a quiet thing, often accompanied by guilt, silence, or sorrow. In one preserved letter from 1710, a woman in Poitou writes, "I eat alone now. My husband and son sleep beneath the hill. I plant with their spade and I carry their coat on cold days. I do not wish for more, only for enough." This was survival after the frost, not triumph but endurance. Echoes in the present. Today, the Great Frost of 1709 is largely unknown outside academic circles. It lacks the dramatic framing of a war, the emotional resonance of a plague, or the moral clarity of a revolution. It was slow, boring, monotonous, deadly. But that is what makes it important. Because the real tests of human society often do not arrive with flags or fire, but with weather and time and hunger. And what matters most is not how people fight, but how they wait, how they endure, how they survive. Final reflection. In a world shaped by heat and war, what do we learn from the cold? The Great Frost of 1709 left no heroes, but perhaps, in its quiet devastation, it taught us more about what it means to persist when there is nothing left to do but keep breathing. Story 4. The Icebound Port Winter in Archangel, 1595. The sails disappear behind a curtain of fog. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Hopewell returns to England, its hull creaking under barrels of furs and casks of wax. You are not on it. You stand at the edge of the wharf in Archangel, Russia's northernmost port. The wind rises off the White Sea, filled with the smell of brine and frost. It's September and the ice is already beginning to form. The season has ended. Trade is done. The port is closing. You are here to stay for the next 9 months at least, with no ships, no escape, only snow, silence, and the slow tick of a frozen clock. This is the story of survival on the edge of empire of English merchants, Russian stevedores, and native palmers, who braved the long winter of 1595 in the icebound port of Archangel, the northern gateway of the Tsardom. Long before Russia opened its warm water ports to the south and west, Archangel, or Arkhangelsk, was its only maritime window to Europe. Founded in 1584 by decree of Tsar Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, the port sat on the banks of the northern Dvina River, just inland from the White Sea, a body of water that spent nearly half the year under thick, impassable ice. During the brief summer months, ships from England, the Netherlands, and later Sweden sailed in to trade for timber, tar, hemp, tallow, furs, and wax. In return, they brought cloth, salt, tin, and finished goods. For the English Muscovy Company, Archangel was a lifeline to Eastern wealth. But in winter, it became a dead end. Winter closes in. By mid-October, ice floes began appearing in the estuary. By November, the entire port froze solid. Ships that failed to leave in time were trapped until spring, sometimes crushed by the pressure of moving ice, their hulls splintered with a sound like cannon fire. Those who remained traders, clerks, and sailors had no choice but to adapt. Englishmen unfamiliar with Russian winters quickly learned a new vocabulary of survival. Valenki felted wool boots, essential for walking on ice. Banya steam bathhouses, where sweat and frost intermingled. Kasha porridge, served hot with salt or lard, eaten daily. Some lived in merchant lodges, timber structures built by the Muscovy Company to house their agents. Others rented rooms in Palmer homes, paying with iron nails, cloth, or salted fish. By December, the sun barely rose. Days were short, the snow deep, and the wind endless. Life without the sea. The port of Archangel in winter was a ghost town. Cranes stood frozen mid-motion. Ropes snapped like dry branches in the cold. Warehouses locked shut, their contents sealed under frost. The Dvina River, once bustling with barges, became a path of snow used by sleds, sleighs, and wolves alike. The market square, lively in summer, shrank to a scattering of stalls selling onions, dried mushrooms, and rough mittens. Trade ceased, but life did not. Locals shifted to winter rhythms. Fishing under ice, using hand-drilled holes and weighted nets. Hunting, especially for hares, foxes, and sometimes reindeer. Logging, which could continue so long as the axes stayed sharp and the blood stayed warm. Foreigners, especially English merchants, found the routines alien. Many grew sick in the first weeks, frostbite, malnutrition, and what they called the Russian lung, likely pneumonia or pleurisy. Those who survived adapted, sometimes grudgingly. Cultural divides in the cold. The Englishmen who stayed in Archangel through winter found themselves caught between two worlds. They were Protestants in an Orthodox land, viewed with suspicion. They spoke little Russian, relying on translators or miming. They were guests, but often ungrateful ones, complaining of food, customs, and weather. Yet necessity bred humility. Russian hosts, especially Palmer fisher families, often extended hospitality. In exchange for goods or labor, they offered shelter, banya access, and lessons in surviving the endless cold. Some English clerks learned to sew their own fur mittens. Others helped carry logs or salt fish. A few learned enough Russian to barter on their own. One account from the Muscovy Company mentions, Master Thomas did strike the cook over the fish pot, was fined in salt and kept to quarters. He is learning his manners now. Humor, bitterness, and boredom filled the months. The boredom of the trapped. There is no drama in waiting for ice to melt. For months the port was locked in stillness. Time passed in routines. Eating porridge or dried bread. Mending tools, furs, and boots. Writing letters that would not be sent until summer. Reading the same books over and over, often Fox's Book of Martyrs or the Psalms. Games were invented, dice, chess, or throwing pebbles at rats. Drinking was common, vodka for Russians, beer or spirits for the English, until supplies ran out. Some turned inward. Journals from the time reflect this isolation. One merchant, William Gage, wrote in January 1596, "We eat at the 6th hour, the fire fails at the 8th. I have now read the 3rd chapter of John 10 times. The snow outside is endless. I have not spoken aloud today." This was winter in Archangel, not heroic, but quiet, repetitive, and exhausting. Religious practices and quiet negotiations. With Orthodox and Protestant traditions clashing, religious life became awkward. The Russians celebrated Christmas in January by the Julian calendar, the English in December. The English refused to cross themselves or bow before icons. The Russians fasted often, avoiding meat or dairy on holy days. Tensions rose when the Muscovy Company insisted on holding private services. Russian priests objected. Local officials, wary of disrupting trade, allowed it so long as it remained discreet. Some compromise emerged. Englishmen sometimes attended Orthodox services as observers. Russians occasionally tolerated English hymns so long as they remained indoors. This uneasy coexistence would foreshadow greater religious diplomacy in later Anglo-Russian relations. Story 4. The Icebound Port Winter in Archangel, 1595. The winter deepens. The days contract into gray slivers of light, and even the most stubborn merchant learns to move slowly, speak softly, and conserve everything. Food, firewood, energy, and spirit all must be rationed. In Archangel, the cold does not strike like a storm. It seeps quietly until it is simply everywhere. The English traders now count their days not by progress but by survival. One more sunrise, one more hot meal, one less man coughing. In these endless months, the port ceases to be a place of commerce and becomes something else, a test of endurance, a crucible of adaptation. This is the heart of the winter of 1595, when life in Archangel became not about profit, but about staying alive with dignity. Salt, smoke, and scarcity. As January turned into February, supplies began to dwindle. Even for the better-prepared Muscovy Company lodges, the stacks of dried cod, salted beef, and black rye bread were shrinking. The barrels of beer had frozen solid weeks ago. The last of the apples, withered and soft, were boiled into a thin stew with scraps of pork fat. To cope with the bitter temperatures and growing hunger, meat was smoked over smoldering pine to stretch it longer. Bones were boiled twice, sometimes 3 times, to extract every trace of fat. Pickled cabbage and onions were eaten sparingly, not for flavor, but to ward off scurvy. The Russians, experienced in these cycles, used frozen fish soup, heated daily from a shared pot that never fully emptied. A Palmer saying went, "A full pot is a short memory. An empty pot is a long day." Meanwhile, the English tried baking hardtack with lard and oats. When flour ran low, they crushed dried peas into meal. It worked barely. The long illness. As the light faded further, sickness arrived, not sudden but creeping. Coughs deepened into chest-rattling sickness. Lips cracked from cold and dehydration. Teeth loosened from poor diet and infection. The worst was scurvy, a disease they still didn't fully understand. Men's gums swelled and bled. Legs stiffened. Spirits sank. Those afflicted grew quiet, their skin blotched with bruises. A Russian healer was brought in, an old Palmer woman, half feared, half revered. She boiled spruce needles in water and insisted on raw fish, which the English resisted until desperation won out. Some improved, others died, not many but enough to leave bunks empty. Death was handled without ceremony. The ground was too hard to dig, so bodies were stored in outbuildings, wrapped in furs. Burial would wait until spring, a grim practice but a common one. Tension between guests and hosts. By February, tensions frayed between the English merchants and their Russian hosts. Complaints of stolen would surface. Some Englishmen accused locals of sneaking into supply sheds at night. The Russians countered that the English had hoarded grain meant for trade, now spoiled. Arguments broke out over access to the banya, with Englishmen accused of improper behavior, refusing to bathe naked, entering at the wrong hour, etc. Misunderstandings multiplied, but violence was rare. The cost of conflict was too high in a place where everyone relied on everyone else. Instead, a fragile truce held. Joint hunts were arranged. Shared meals became more frequent. A Russian boy taught an English clerk to trap snow hares. In return, the Englishmen offered wool thread and taught numbers in Latin. One Muscovy Company record from March 1596 notes, "Though our manners clash, the cold makes equals of us all. The fish we eat comes from their line. The salt they use comes from our ship. That is all there is." The role of the Orthodox Church. Though spiritual differences remained sharp, the Orthodox Church in Archangel played a quiet role during the winter. Priests offered blessings for the sick, regardless of creed. Church stores distributed candles and dried bread during Holy Week. Englishmen were invited to observe the Epiphany ice procession, though few accepted. For their part, the English held private prayer, often reading from the Psalter in unison. There was no formal chapel, but a single wooden cross stood in the company lodge. The juxtaposition was strange. Incense and icons in one room, psalms and plain prayers in the next. But by midwinter, neither side had the strength to argue over dogma. Silence became the shared language of faith. A world in ice. By late winter, the entire White Sea was a field of snow. Locals crossed it on sleds to reach distant villages. Some traveled dozens of miles to trade dried fish or birch bark goods. These crossings where dangerous whiteouts could disorient even experienced travelers. But the frozen sea also offered opportunity. The English organized ice races with Russian sleighs, part distraction, part competition. Wagers were placed in cloves and bootlaces. No one kept strict score. Children, Russian and English alike, carved figures from ice horses, ships, even tiny churches. They melted quickly in the sun, but for a few moments they were art. In the stillness of that winter, imagination flourished where conversation faltered. It begins with a sound, not a storm nor a scream, but a low, distant crack like a tree trunk groaning under its own weight. Then another, and another. By early April, the surface of the Dvina River shudders beneath a sheen of morning sunlight, the first break in the ice. You stand with others at the river's edge, squinting into the wind. The air still bites, but the sky is less gray than it was. Hope begins to thaw alongside the river. Yet in Archangel, nothing ends quickly. The sea is still frozen. The roads are still blocked. And while spring may be coming, survival is not over. This is the story of the thaw, the slow and difficult return to motion. A time of reckoning, of inventory, of burying the dead and reopening the port. And a moment to ask what all of it, this long, tedious winter, meant. The ritual of the thaw. In Archangel, the ice never vanished overnight. It retreated in stages. First, the snow softened, turning roads into slush. Then the river ice cracked, sending slabs drifting downstream. Finally, the sea ice loosened, breaking into floes and melting in patches. Locals marked the progress with quiet ceremony. The Orthodox Church held prayers for safe travel, and processions resumed. The Banya, once a place of survival, now became a site of celebration. But the thaw also brought danger. As the river broke, entire bridges gave way. Sled paths became death traps. Wolves, now desperate, came closer to town. And with the melt came the return of sickness. Waterborne diseases, spoiled food, and respiratory infections from mold growing in damp lodges. Recovery was not a sunrise, it was a fog. Burials and books. The first task after the thaw was burying the dead. Frozen bodies stored in barns and sheds were finally given to the earth. Graves were dug in still-chilled soil. There were no funerals, only short prayers, hasty shovels, and wooden markers. Englishmen who died over the winter were buried in a small clearing beyond the port. One Muscovy Company scribe wrote, "Here lie 4, Clerk Edward, Cook Thomas, Sailor James, one unknown. They did not complain." Meanwhile, records were compiled. Trade ledgers updated. Losses tallied. Requests prepared for the next arriving ship. Letters written months ago and sealed in wax were dusted off and bundled for dispatch. They bore news of hardship but also business. Prices stable, winter tolerable, supplies low. The language of survival filtered through the language of commerce. Even grief, it seemed, had to be accounted. Preparations for the sea. By late April, the port stirred again. Ropes were untangled. Warehouses aired. The crane arms, still frozen mid-motion, were thawed and oiled. The locals resumed their pre-summer rituals. Nets were repaired, sails stitched, and sledges converted back to carts. The Englishmen cleaned their quarters, burned bedding infested with lice, and began writing up trade inventories not of what they had sold, but what they had lost. Every spring brought a gamble. Would the ships return? Would they bring what was promised? Would the company renew its trust in a port so distant, so harsh? Still they prepared, because this is what traders did. They endured, they recorded, and they tried again. Reflections and departures. For the Englishmen who survived the winter of 1595, the thaw brought not joy, but reflection. One clerk, writing in the margins of a shipping manifest, noted, "I feared the cold would break me, but it was not the cold, it was the sameness, the repetition, each day a copy of the last until even dreams froze." Another left a letter to his brother in London. "I have seen the sea as stone. I have drunk fish oil in the dark and been grateful. I now know what silence means." Some chose to remain in Archangel for another season. Others, once the first ship arrived, packed their bags and left without ceremony, vanishing into the fog of early May. No monuments were erected, no journals published, but among the few who knew the port in winter, there was a quiet pride, a bond of the frozen. Legacy of an icebound year. The winter of 1595 was not recorded as a historic crisis. No cities fell, no kings died, but for those in Archangel it was a defining silence. The Muscovy Company continued to trade there for decades. Russia expanded southward, seeking ice-free ports, eventually founding St. Petersburg in 1703. Archangel remained important, but faded as warmer waters opened new routes. And the winter rhythms of boiling fish skin, of sewing fur mittens by candlelight, of learning to wait without purpose disappeared into memory. But in their quiet way, those months defined the edge of European commerce, not through conquest or capital, but through endurance. Final reflection. When the world freezes and nothing moves, perhaps the only true measure of strength is whether you are still standing when it all begins to thaw. The men of Archangel didn't win. They didn't flee. They simply remained. And in history, sometimes that is enough. Story 5. The Winter Parliament, Iceland's Althing under snow. Snow drifts gather on the ancient Law Rock. The wind howls across Thingvellir Plain, bending low the wooden posts that mark the old assembly grounds. Beneath layers of ice and time, the stones remain, silent witnesses to centuries of frozen law. It is winter in Iceland, cold, dark, and unrelenting. And yet the Althing, the world's oldest surviving parliament, meets still. You stand beside the fire, wrapped in wool and seal skin, your face raw from wind and snow. You are not a chieftain, perhaps, but you have traveled far. A summons has been issued. The thing must be held. The people must speak, even in the depth of winter. This is the story of Iceland's unique legal tradition, how law and custom endured not in marble halls but in tents, caves, and snow-covered fields, fueled by memory, firelight, and persistence. Thingvellir, the parliament in the valley. Since its founding in 930 CE, the Althing had met each year at Thingvellir, the assembly fields. Located in a rift valley carved by tectonic plates, it was not only a symbolic location, it was also central, neutral, and known. Originally held in June, the summer assembly drew chieftains, farmers, law speakers, and the curious. They gathered to settle disputes, pass judgments, recite laws, and reaffirm alliances. But by the late 1500s, Iceland's climate had grown colder. The Little Ice Age was reaching its peak, and harsh summers meant delayed travel, thin crops and growing disputes over property and survival. Records indicate that winter sessions, though rare, were sometimes convened by necessity when conflicts could not wait, when royal orders demanded reading, or when regional disasters had to be addressed. One such winter session was held in 1597, during a year of blizzards, famine, and plague among sheep. Who came to the winter Althing? The Althing was not a parliament in the modern sense. There were no elected officials or permanent seats. Instead, chieftains Gathar presided, law speakers Lurgsargumithur recited oral codes, and farmers came to bear witness or seek judgment. In a winter session, travel was treacherous. Only the most committed or desperate made the journey. Many arrived on horseback, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, with food bundled beneath their saddles. Some came on sleds, drawn by dogs or ponies, crossing frozen rivers and fjords. Tents were pitched near warm springs, using geothermal heat for shelter. Records suggest that a winter Althing might draw only 40-50 participants, as opposed to the hundreds who came in summer, but those who came had urgent needs. The role of the lawspeaker. At the heart of the assembly stood the Lurgsargumithur, the lawspeaker. His role was to recite the law aloud, as it was not yet fully written. Icelandic law, passed down through generations, was committed to memory. In cold months, the burden was even heavier. Bundled against the wind, the lawspeaker would stand on the Lurgberg law rock, or if too harsh, within a sod hut, and recite sections of the Gragaz, the Icelandic law code. He had to remember property rights, inheritance structures, punishments for theft, adultery, and homicide, ritual formulas for declarations and oaths. In the dark months, this oral tradition became both a performance and an act of preservation. Without memory, there was no law, and without law, only chaos. Law and warmth, how debates took place. Debate did not occur in chambers or halls, but in tents, shelters, or communal longhouses. Fires were kept burning with driftwood and turf, sparingly used. Participants sat in furs, drinking whey, beer, or sheep's broth. Testimonies were given by lantern light, faces half-lit by flickering flame. Decisions were reached by consensus among Gathar, with witnesses present. Penalties might be deferred until spring, but the verdict had weight. If the Althing ruled against you, it could mean outlawry, being cast out, even in winter, often a death sentence. Fines, to be paid in butter, cloth, or livestock. Property seizure, rare but enforceable with armed backing. In winter, mercy was sometimes shown not from compassion, but because enforcement was logistically difficult. Conflict survival in law. Many winter sessions were convened not for politics, but for land disputes and resource claims. In a land where hay was scarce, fish could determine a family's survival. A single ewe could be a dowry. Law became not abstract justice, but the difference between life and death. One recorded winter case from 1597 involved a dispute between two families over access to a warm spring used for bathing sheep and curing hides. The spring had shifted course due to frost, causing confusion over whose land it now flowed through. The Althing ruled in favor of shared seasonal use, with penalties for hoarding. The decision avoided bloodshed, but only just. Social bonds in the dark. Despite the purpose of law, the winter Althing was also a place for stories, songs, and shared endurance. At night, participants gathered in shelters to recite sagas, tales of early settlers, of ghosts and kin strife. Sing rimmer, the rhythmic poetic epics unique to Iceland. Trade goods, wool, fishhooks, carved bone, and fermented shark. This cultural sharing kept memory alive, passing oral traditions alongside law. One chieftain wrote in his personal journal, "We meet not only to settle wrongs, but to remember who we are. The cold does not ask who is right, it only asks who will stand the longest. The wind has calmed. The tents flap gently now, rather than crack like sails in a storm. Inside the makeshift shelters at Thingvellir, the fires are dying down, their warmth preserved only in stones and the layers of sheepskin that pad the earth. A bowl of cold broth is passed from hand to hand. The lawspeaker will speak again at dawn. But this is not just about law anymore. The winter Althing has become something more, a memory machine, keeping Iceland's fragile society bound by words, customs, and the thin thread of human agreement. As the ice grows thicker and daylight shorter, the law does not retreat. It leans into the cold. This is the middle of the story, where the endurance of Iceland's legal tradition is not in parchment or politics, but in the people who kept it alive through the snow, wind, and silence. The power of oral law. In 16th century Iceland, most law was still oral. Though the Greggas laws were written down in earlier centuries, literacy was far from universal. Many Gathar and farmers memorized passages, decisions, and precedents. Disputes were settled not by reference to written codes, but to collective memory, spoken with ritual precision. Legal formulas had to be recited exactly, or they were invalid. Witnesses had to repeat oaths in Icelandic, word for word. A mistake in phrasing could invalidate a claim and ruin a family. In winter, this burden intensified. Cold stiffened tongues, shortened tempers, and dulled the mind. Still, the lawspeaker stood each day on Law Rock or within the longhouse and recited what he remembered. The spoken word was binding, and so every syllable had weight. One elder, hearing a familiar passage about inheritance law, was said to nod and say, "That is the voice of my grandfather's law, and I believe it still." Cases of life and death. Winter brought particular kinds of legal disputes, grim, urgent, and intensely personal. Among the matters addressed at one recorded winter Althing in the 1590s were a boundary dispute over hayfields, where two farms claimed the same patch of land after snow buried the markers; a charge of manslaughter, resulting from a fight over seal meat during a lean month; a petition for clemency, brought by a widow whose son, outlawed the previous summer, was found sheltering in a cave nearby. That last case is notable, according to the oral record. The widow knelt before the assembly, offering seal blubber and a carved cross. She argued that her son had stolen only firewood and had returned to his family, repentant and starving. The Gathar, after long discussion, reduced his outlawry to 1 year, provided he paid a fine and left the region for the remainder. It was a rare instance of mercy in a system known for its rigidity, but it showed the flexibility of custom when balanced with community survival. Justice by consensus. The Althing's decisions were rarely unilateral. Most verdicts were made by panel discussions among leading chieftains and the lawspeaker, informed by testimony from witnesses and the judgment of the community. In a winter setting, these discussions were held indoors around smoky hearths in low turf-walled shelters, carried out in low voices, both to conserve breath and to avoid heated arguments that could ignite into conflict, marked by long pauses as the participants sat in silence, considering both the facts and the consequences. There was no gavel, no formal closing. The decision would be spoken aloud, then acknowledged by a nod, a shared drink, or a quiet "so be it." The power of the Althing was not in coercion but in recognition. If people accepted the decision, it stood. If they did not, the cost was often exile or feud. Feud and forgiveness. The Icelandic legal tradition was closely tied to the idea of honor and balance. A wrong unaddressed could lead to blood feud, a cycle of vengeance between families. The Althing existed in part to prevent this. Compensation was paid in livestock, land, or wool, depending on the crime. In some cases, A marriage was arranged between feuding families to resolve long-term hostility. If consensus failed, the losing party might be declared an outlaw, a sentence worse than prison, because it meant no one could feed, house, or assist the person under pain of punishment. In the winter of 1597, a dispute over a stolen lamb nearly erupted into violence between two farming clans. After hours of debate and witness testimony, the Althing ruled that the accused would repay double the value of the lamb in cheese and smoked fish. The accuser would withdraw a separate, unrelated claim, restoring the balance. It was not justice as we know it, but it worked. Language, story, and memory. After sessions ended each evening, words did not stop. They changed form. Chieftains told ancestral sagas, reinforcing their lineage and legitimacy. Farmers recounted dreams and omens, linking the present to the mythic past. Skalds, poets composed new verses, some commemorating decisions, others mocking poor arguments. One such verse, preserved in oral form, mocked a chieftain who slipped on ice during his speech. Baldur of bluster, he fell with his pride. Law frozen under the boots he tied. The blend of law and humor was not accidental. Icelandic culture prized memory, wit, and reputation. In a land without a centralized army, these were the tools of leadership. The days grow longer. The sun no longer glances off the snow at such a sharp angle. Meltwater trickles underfoot, and the tents at Thingvellir begin to fold inward. The winter Althing is drawing to a close, not with ceremony, but with quiet departure. One by one, the ponies are loaded, the furs packed, and the fires extinguished. The legal matters have been heard. The disputes have been resolved or at least deferred. What remains now is memory, the kind passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, like bread in the dark. You tighten your cloak and turn toward home, not richer, not entirely satisfied, but still part of something older than any one man. A society that endured the dark not through strength, but through stubborn structure. This is the final chapter of the Althing under snow, how the law persisted, even when parchment cracked and ink froze. The Althing's last fires. The end of a winter Althing was marked by ritual simplicity. The law speaker delivered a closing address, often brief, reaffirming unity and order. Fines, reparations, and promises were sealed by handshakes, or in some cases, oaths over iron or ice. Witnesses were called one final time to acknowledge decisions and mark them as accepted. There was no written record, unless a monk or clerk happened to be present to scratch it into vellum by candlelight. Memory was the archive. Each man who attended carried a portion of the law back home with him, retold around the hearths of the island. That act of remembering, repeating verdicts, judgments, and oaths was what kept Iceland's legal tradition alive. The journey home. Departing Thingvellir in winter was no small feat. Roads were unmarked, often erased by storms. Rivers, though mostly frozen, could break beneath a horse's weight. Some travelers used moonlight. Others relied on landmarks known only through oral navigation, the curved rock like a bishop's staff, the tree that leans east, the smell of sulfur near a warm spring. Many traveled in small groups, carrying the law with them, and sometimes carrying the wounded or ill. One 17th-century tale speaks of a man who died of frostbite days after the Althing, his last words recalling a land boundary verdict more clearly than he could remember his son's face. Such stories were not uncommon. Winter took its toll even on survivors. Preserving the law in a changing world. By the late 1500s, Iceland was under increasing Danish rule. The power of the local chieftains was shrinking. The Althing itself, while still respected, had lost some autonomy. Yet the winter assemblies continued intermittently, not every year, not formally sanctioned, but always resurrected in times of need, especially when natural disasters, volcanoes, Floods demanded urgent communal response. Royal edicts from Copenhagen required local interpretation and enforcement. Feuds and land disputes flared during famine, often sparked by nothing more than a shared pasture or a missing ewe. The Danish governors, often absent or disinterested, let these local gatherings persist. In doing so, they accidentally preserved Icelandic legal culture. Because while the official Althing would one day be moved, co-opted, and reshaped, the spirit of the winter sessions, the resolve to gather, speak, and settle remained intact. What law meant in the ice. In the deep months of Iceland's winter, law was not abstract. It was a boundary stone buried in snow, whose memory defined ownership. An oath made around a smoky hearth, its power drawn not from paper, but from those who heard it. A verdict given softly, because loud voices froze in the air and cracked like ice. This wasn't justice as spectacle, it was justice as habit, as ritual, as survival. A legacy carried in silence. What remains of these winter parliaments? Stone ruins at Thingvellir. Faded manuscripts, written down centuries later, often reconstructing what was never written at the time. An oral history, the most fragile and the most persistent. The Althing still exists today. It meets in modern halls, with printed laws, digital votes, and microphones. Yet the idea that society continues even when warmth does not, that has never changed. Winter governance taught Iceland that law must be portable, something you can carry in your head, pass to your child, and speak aloud when no book survives. Final reflection. What is a civilization but an agreement, renewed again and again, even in the dark, even in the cold, even when no one is watching? Iceland's winter parliaments remind us, law does not need light. It only needs memory and the will to gather. Story 6. The Napoleonic retreat, a soldier's march through snow. The snow does not fall in a storm. It drifts, soft, unthreatening, and almost beautiful until it becomes everything. Under it, men sink, horses stumble, wagons freeze, and somewhere between Moscow and the Niemen River, an army begins to vanish. You are a soldier in Napoleon's Grand Armée, marching westward in the winter of 1812. You do not know it yet, but history will remember this retreat not just as a defeat, but as one of the most brutal survival ordeals in European military history. Your uniform offers little warmth. Your boots are splitting. Your hands, once calloused and strong, now tremble with hunger and frostbite. What was once a glorious campaign has become a desperate crawl home. And with each mile, more men fall not to bullets but to cold, starvation, and exhaustion. This is the beginning of the story of Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, seen not from the emperor's tent, but from the icy roads, the frozen rivers, and the blizzard-blind vision of the men who tried to make it home. The road from Moscow. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon finally ordered the retreat from Moscow. After 5 weeks of occupation in a city set ablaze by its own citizens, the emperor saw no other choice. Supplies were dwindling, winter was approaching, and the Russian army, though battered, had not surrendered. At the start of the march westward, the Grand Armée still numbered around 100,000 men, a shadow of the 500,000 that had crossed into Russia in June. They carried almost no food. Frost had already begun, but full winter had not yet arrived. Napoleon chose a southern route to avoid territory already devastated by his own advance, but this detour brought them across destroyed villages, muddy roads, and overextended supply lines. From the outset, the men were already cold. They simply didn't know how much colder it could get. Clothing, rations, and survival. The soldiers of Napoleon's army came from across Europe, French, Polish, Italian, German, Dutch, and more. Many had marched thousands of miles to reach Russia and had been supplied for a summer campaign, not a Russian winter. Their uniforms included thin wool coats often torn, shako hats, which offered little insulation, leather boots soaked through from snow or cracking in the cold. As the army marched, rations disappeared. A slice of black bread, a piece of horseflesh, or a handful of flour was a luxury. Horses began to die, first from exhaustion, then starvation. Their flesh was boiled, their bones burned for warmth. Soldiers scavenged, eating bark, shoe leather, and any remaining stores left behind by the Russians. There were no tents. Men slept outdoors, huddled in groups, or burrowed into the snow like animals. Entire regiments disappeared overnight, not in battle, but to exposure. The weather turns. By early November, the first major blizzard struck near Smolensk. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees C, -4 degrees F and lower. Frostbite set in within hours. Soldiers' ears turned black, fingers snapped like twigs. Muskets jammed, wheels of wagons froze solid, bread became rock hard. The Russian army under General Kutuzov did not need to attack. They simply followed, harassing the rear guard, cutting off stragglers, and letting winter do the work. The roads were littered with corpses frozen in strange positions, sometimes clutching rifles, sometimes with arms raised, as if warding off the cold. Abandoned cannons, their crews long dead. Wrecked wagons, their contents looted or consumed. Every step became a test, every sunrise a surprise. A new day meant one had not died during the night. Encounters with the peasantry. The Russian peasantry had suffered greatly during Napoleon's advance. Their villages were burned, their grain stolen, and their sons conscripted. Now, on the retreat, many saw an opportunity for revenge. Stragglers were captured, stripped, and beaten, sometimes killed. Others were given bread, but only in exchange for clothing or gold luxuries the soldiers no longer possessed. Some peasants fled entirely, burning their own homes to deny shelter to the invaders. A French corporal later recalled, "We knocked on doors with bleeding hands. They stared at us, unblinking, as though we were already ghosts. In truth, we were." Few could blame the villagers. They had survived their own winter under Napoleon's army. Now they simply outlasted him. The role of discipline. As the cold worsened, discipline broke down. Officers no longer enforced ranks. Many marched as common soldiers, indistinguishable in their rags. Desertion became constant, though there was nowhere to desert to. Men fought over dead horses, even friends turning on one another for a scrap of meat or a glove. Napoleon tried to maintain command. He issued orders, summoned reports, and held court. But his aura of invincibility had begun to fade. The soldiers no longer cheered his name, they simply followed, silently. One Polish officer wrote in his journal, "Even the emperor walks slower now. He stares at the snow as though it mocks him. We used to sing. Now we only breathe." The Berezina River was not wide. On a map, it cut a narrow curve through the flat terrain of what is now Belarus. But in the winter of 1812, it became a symbol of despair, a place where frozen mud, collapsing bridges, and Russian ambushes turned retreat into massacre. By the time the Grand Armée reached the Berezina in late November, it had become a shuffling crowd. Soldiers, civilians, camp followers, wounded men, and what remained of the French rear guard all converged on the river's icy banks. Thousands, barely clothed, starving, and frostbitten, looked across the dark, half-frozen water and saw only one thing: escape or death. This was the turning point of the retreat, where order shattered completely, where some lived through impossible odds and others perished by the hundreds each hour, and where the last remnants of Napoleon's dream of Russian conquest slipped beneath the ice. Approaching the river. By November 24, the army had dwindled to less than 40,000, including a mix of soldiers and non-combatants. Napoleon hoped to cross the Berezina and reach relative safety in Lithuania, but the Russian armies had moved to cut him off. To the north was General Wittgenstein, and to the south, Admiral Chichagov. Between them, Napoleon had one narrow chance, a hidden crossing point near the village of Studzianka, where the ice on the river was unstable but not impassable. He ordered his engineers, under General Jean-Baptiste Blay, to do the impossible: build 2 bridges in freezing water under enemy fire, with no solid timber and barely functioning tools. And yet they began. Building the bridges. The bridge building at Berezina became a feat of engineering and self-sacrifice. The river was not yet frozen solid, making it impassable on foot or horse. The water was icy black, about 40 meters wide, and rising due to melting snow upstream. The few remaining engineers worked knee-deep in freezing water, using wrecked wagons and makeshift tools. General Blay, himself frostbitten, burned his own pontoon wagons to make beams. His men worked around the clock, their hands cracked and bleeding, suffering hypothermia and collapse. A French colonel wrote, "They died at their posts, holding ropes in hands that had gone numb hours before. We crossed because they did not stop." By November 26, the first bridge was ready for infantry. The second for wagons and artillery followed. The race was on. The crossing begins. The crossing was chaotic from the first moment. Thousands surged toward the bridge's infantry: officers, wagons, civilians, wounded men in carts, children, dogs, even goats. Panic spread with rumors that the bridges would be destroyed before all had crossed. Some tried to swim, instantly swept under by the cold current. Napoleon crossed early, with his Imperial Guard, securing the West Bank and directing the defense. Behind him, the tragedy unfolded. Wagons toppled into the river. Cannons were abandoned, some pushed in deliberately to make room. The weak were trampled, mothers screamed for lost children, soldiers pushed comrades aside for a place on the narrow planks. Over 2 days, tens of thousands attempted to cross, but not all would make it. The Russians close in. The Russians launched relentless attacks during the crossing. Artillery rained down on the riverbanks. Cavalry charged the exposed flank. Skirmishers picked off engineers and stragglers. Napoleon's rearguard, led by Marshal Ney and Marshal Victor, held back waves of Russian assaults, often at bayonet point. One regiment fought from behind broken carts, waist-deep in slush and mud, their muskets barely firing. They delayed the enemy long enough for thousands to get across. But when the fighting surged too close to the bridges, and the army's corps had crossed, the engineers were ordered to burn the bridges even as thousands still waited on the east bank. The horror unfolded in minutes. Desperate men jumped into the water. Some clung to the burning beams, screaming. The rest stood still, surrounded by flames and Russian bayonets, and were cut down or froze in place. Estimates say 10,000 to 15,000 men, women, and children died at the Berezina. Aftermath: what remained? After Berezina, the army was no longer an army. Survivors continued westward, some on foot, some on stolen carts. There was no supply line, no command structure, and no medicine. Most had no shoes. Many wrapped their feet in straw or animal skins. Napoleon, now visibly gaunt and worn, stopped addressing his men directly. He sent envoys ahead to Vilnius to prepare supplies, but found little waiting. In his private writings, he would later call the Berezina a glorious tragedy. But to those who lived it, there was nothing glorious. A Polish lancer wrote, "The river took our voices. We crossed in silence and it left us hollow." By December 1812, the snow was no longer an enemy. It had become the landscape itself, the only constant. The men still marching westward no longer feared battle, nor even the Russian army. What they feared was the night, the stillness, and the deep, bone-deep hunger that came not from a day's fasting, but from weeks of consuming little more than frost-bitten scraps. The Grand Armée no longer existed as a fighting force. What remained were bands of survivors, strung out along the roads between Berezina and Vilnius. They did not march in formation. They did not sing. They shuffled, limped, and crawled wrapped in rags, faces blackened with soot, eyes dulled by suffering. This is how an empire's ambitions ended. Not in surrender, not in glory, but in quiet disintegration, one man at a time, swallowed by the endless white. The final march to Vilnius. After the Berezina crossing, the remaining soldiers had to cover nearly 300 kilometers to reach Vilnius, now Lithuania's capital, which they hoped would offer food, shelter, and safety. The conditions were indescribable. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees C, degrees F. Snowstorms raged without warning, causing entire columns to vanish from the road. The ground was so frozen that men could not bury their dead. Corpses simply lined the route, sometimes propped like scarecrows, frozen where they sat or fell. The few towns and villages still standing along the route had no capacity to feed or house tens of thousands. Most had been stripped bare already by fleeing armies or by earlier foraging raids. Even when a building was found, its floor was likely already covered in dying men, shoulder to shoulder. Fires were rare, no fuel remained. The stench of gangrene and rot filled the air. One French surgeon, still tending to the wounded with bare hands, wrote, "They no longer ask for help, they simply lie down and wait. It is as if the soul leaves before the body does." Cannibalism and collapse. Though officially denied in French records, multiple eyewitnesses both within and outside the army record instances of cannibalism among the starving troops. Dead horses had long since disappeared. Bark, leather belts, even parchment from books were eaten. In some villages, bodies were stripped not just of clothing but of flesh. The line between survival and humanity thinned with every step. Some men, driven mad by hunger and cold, began to hallucinate believing themselves home already, or talking to family members long dead. Others became dangerously violent, attacking fellow soldiers for food, clothing, or firewood. Still, some chose to protect others, sharing their last scraps of bread or helping injured comrades drag sleds for a few more miles. Amid horror, there were flickers of human dignity, but they were rare and often fatal. Napoleon departs. On December 5, near the town of Smorgoni, Napoleon made a fateful decision. He left the army, handing command to Marshal Murat. He disguised himself in a peasant's fur coat and traveled swiftly by sleigh toward Paris. His goal was to stabilize his empire and suppress the growing unrest sparked by rumors of the Russian disaster. Napoleon would later claim he was still in command, still present in spirit. But to the men dying in snowdrifts between Minsk and Vilnius, the emperor had vanished. Many never knew he had left, others felt betrayed. One sergeant scrawled a note in charcoal on the wall of an abandoned mill. "He marched us to Moscow and rode alone home." The fall into Vilnius. By the time the remnants of the army reached Vilnius on December 9, only about 10,000 men were still capable of walking. Vilnius was unprepared, its stores already plundered, its hospitals overwhelmed. Thousands more died within days, succumbing to cold, disease, or malnutrition even as they arrived. When the Russian forces entered the city days later, they captured thousands more, including the wounded and those too weak to flee again. Some survivors were carried into cellars, where they were stacked like cordwood, silent, unmoving, still alive but too weak to speak. A local priest wrote, "They came like ghosts and became snow in the streets. We buried what we could, but most we simply stepped around." Counting the dead. Of the roughly 600,000 soldiers who crossed into Russia in the summer of 1812, only about 100,000 returned, and even fewer were fit for combat. Some froze, some starved. Others died from disease, wounds, or prison camps. An estimated 380,000 to 400,000 perished, one of the deadliest military campaigns in history. But statistics cannot tell the full story. The retreat from Moscow became a lesson not in military failure, but in human vulnerability. The world's most powerful army had not been defeated by superior firepower or brilliant tactics, but by logistics, weather, and the terrible indifference of nature. Reflections on survival. Those who lived did so through a combination of luck, endurance, and the ability to adapt. They burned everything that would burn. They learned to sleep in groups, wrapping themselves like mummies. They shed rank and title. Officers marched alongside privates. Nobles begged for bread. Many returned home unrecognizable to families that had already mourned them, or to governments that offered no support. Some never spoke of the campaign again. And yet some told stories, quietly, to grandchildren, to friends, around fires, about the endless snow and the boots they stuffed with straw and the road that was no longer a road but a white line drawn across a dying world. Final reflection. Victory has many fathers, but survival has none. In the end, what remains of a retreat? Not the medals, not the strategy, only the stories told by those who returned and the silence of those who did not.